I'm Rick Rathburn, President and School Director of TDDS Technical Institute in Lake Milton, Ohio. Our training facility was established over 35 years ago with one mission in mind: train people properly to become professional truck drivers. TDDS Tech has taught people to become professional truck drivers since 1973 and plan to do so for many years to come. This is a training video on how to do a proper Class A CDL pre-trip inspection. Please realize that this pre-trip inspection is only part of your CDL exams. This video does not guarantee that you will pass your CDL test. Helping us today on our pre-trip inspection is Larry Bram. Larry is our Director of Truck Driver Training and Safety. Larry had 15 years out over the road and has been with the school for 20 years. Larry is also a CDL examiner. So he's going to go through the training tape with you, step by step. Listen to what he says. I'll be back a little later to ask you a few questions. So let's get things rolling and teach you how to pre-trip this rig.
Start with, we're going to do our approach. We're looking under the truck. We're looking for ground leaks, whether it be oil, coolant, power steering fluid, diesel fuel. Then we'll tilt the hood. First thing I come to is my power steering fluid level. I would pull the dipstick. I would make sure it's between the add and full mark. I'd follow my hoses down, make sure they're not cut or frayed. Leaking power steering fluid, which leads me to my power steering pump. I want to make sure the nuts and bolts are tight on it. I want to make sure it's also not leaking any power steering fluid. Then here I come to my air compressor. I want to make sure it's mounted securely, nuts and bolts are tight. I'm checking my hoses and make sure the fittings are all tight and secure and it's not leaking. I'm going to start with my sight glass on my coolant. Make sure that it is up to the proper level. If it was not, or if I didn't have a sight glass, I could take my cap off, stick my finger in if the engine was cool, and I should be able to just touch coolant. Come down here to my oil stick. I check the oil level. It should be between the add and full mark. Then I come to my power steering pump. I want to make sure that it's mounted securely, the nuts and bolts are tight, and it's not leaking any coolant. Under that, I have my alternator. I want to make sure it is mounted securely, the nuts and bolts are tight. I want to make sure that the wires are fastened securely and the nuts on them are tight. It is belt driven, therefore I want to check my belt, proper tension, 1/2 to 3/4 inch. And it should not be cut or frayed. Then I'll come to my spring suspension mounts, the front and rear mounts. I want to make sure first of all that the nuts and bolts are tight, making sure there's no cracks radiating from the bolt holes. Checking the bushing to make sure it's there and is functional. Check my springs to make sure that they're all there, they're not shifted, not cracked, broke, or missing. Check the U-bolts. Make sure the U-bolts are there and they are tight, checking that the nuts are secured on the bottom. Brings me to my shock. I want to make sure it's mounted securely, the nuts and bolts are tight. The rubber bushings are good. Also, I want to make sure that it is not leaking oil. Then I come to my power steering gearbox. I want to make sure it's mounted securely, nuts and bolts are tight. Not leaking any power steering fluid. Checking the hose and make sure they're not cut, frayed, or leaking. I want to check my steering linkages, be my pitman arm, my drag link, and my steering arm. Check the ball joints to make sure that they are secure and not loose. Check the castle nut on it and a Carter pin on both ends to make sure they're all tight. Then I come to my brake chamber hose. I want to make sure it's fastened tight, not leaking air, not cut or frayed. Come to my brake chamber, make sure it's mounted securely, nuts and bolts are tight, it's not dented, doesn't have any holes rusted through it. And my clamp, I want to make sure it's there and not loose. Brings me to my slack adjuster and push rod. To check my slack adjuster, I would chock the wheels, release the brakes, and if it pulled about 1 inch, then that means it needs adjusted. When the brakes are fully applied, it should not be less than 90 degrees. On the steer axle, I really wouldn't have to chock the wheels, but it's a good idea to chock them anytime you're checking brakes. My push rod, I want to make sure that the rod itself is not bent. Make sure my castle nut is, or my jam nut is tight. Make sure my clevis pin is there and I have a Carter key. I'm going to come to the brake lining. Make sure they're not worn dangerously thin. Make sure I have no grease or oil on them and are not cracked. I want to check my brake drum. I want to make sure it's not cracked or broken. It can also be seen from out here. Make sure it's not cracked or broken. And I'll be checking to make sure there are no springs or bolts laying in the bottom. That brings me to my tire. I want to check my tire proper tread depth all the way across is 4/32 in every major groove. Should not have recaps on the steer tire. I want to check the inside and outside of my sidewalls. Make sure I have no cuts or bulges. As I'm looking for cuts and bulges, I'm going around checking my rim, looking for any bends, breaks, or welds not factory. Check my valve stem, make sure it's here, centered, has a metal cap. I check pressure with a gauge. I don't have one, therefore I'm going to visually inspect the tire to see if it's flat or low. I check my lug nuts first of all to make sure there are none missing. I'm looking for rust trails or cracks radiating from the bolt holes, which would indicate looseness. Bring me to my hub oil seal. I'm checking for leaks. This is a sealed hub, therefore you can't check the level. However, I would still check for a spray pattern on the inside and outside of the tire that would indicate a leak from the oil seal. Okay, at this time we'll go ahead and close the hood, get inside, and we'll do our in-cab check. In this box here I have my reflective triangles. I would have a spare fuse for each size amperage, other than the fact that this vehicle here does have circuit breakers. When I open the door here, we have a properly rated and charged fire extinguisher. I would also make sure the mounting on my seat belt is correct, and when I get inside I'll make sure to adjust properly for me. Okay, we'll get inside the cab then. Alright, next we'll do a safe start. We're going to make sure we're in neutral, push the clutch in, start the engine. First thing I want to check is my oil pressure. I want to make sure it builds to the proper level, somewhere between 20 and 40 psi. Then I want to check my coolant. Make sure that the temperature rises and should not overheat. I want to check my volts. Checking the volts to make sure it shows charging, it's showing about 14 volts. Then I come to my left indicator, my right indicator, four-way indicators. Now I'm going to check my high and low beam. To do that, I'm going to turn the lights on. Also want to check to see that my dash is illuminated. And I will check my high and low beam indicator. And it's working as well. Then I move over here. I want to check I want to check why air pressure builds up to the proper cutout level between 120 and 125. It should cut back in at 100 psi. Moving on over, I'm going to check my wipers. Make sure they work. Make sure that my washer float is working as well. I'm also looking at the wipers to make sure the blades are not torn, and I'm looking for a good sweep across the window, which means I have proper tension. Now I want to check my windshield. Make sure it's clean. Make sure it's not cracked or broken. Make sure I do not have any stickers that are outdated. Then I go to my mirrors. I want to check both mirrors and make sure they're not cracked, broken, and they're clean, and that they're adjusted for me because I'm the driver now. Then I come to my heater and defrost. I'm going to put it on the floor, turn the heater on, fill for air. Then we'll put it to defrost, checking for air to make sure my defrost is working. Then we're going to go to the steering wheel play. Should look outside. 2-inch play on the 20-inch wheel, couldn't be in trouble. Then I have a steady horn and an air horn. Then that brings me to my air brake test. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and do my parking brake test. Because I do have a truck and a trailer, I'm going to test both brakes. First, I'm going to push in my tractor parking brake, put it in gear, and I'm actually going to tug against my trailer brakes. Okay. Then I'm going to release the trailer. Apply the tractor parking brake, stuck against it as well. It's also working. Then I would do a service brake test. I'm going to pull forward 5 miles per hour, about 5 miles per hour, then I'm going to apply the brake. I'm going to feel for pulling to one side or the other. Now I apply my brake. Now I was feeling for pulling to one side or the other. I did not feel any. Then I want to leave my brakes released, or I could apply them. But what I'm going to do now is shut the engine off, turn the key back on, leave it in gear. Now this is the only time I would leave a vehicle in gear like this. I'm going to be inside. I would never do that if I was outside. But I want my brakes released. I'm going to do an air pressure leakage rate. I'm going to check my gauges here with the buttons released, time it for 1 minute. I should not lose any more than 3 psi in 1 minute with the brakes released, and I'm also going to wait for the pressure to stabilize. So now I'm timing. Okay, now I'm going to apply firm pressure or 90 pounds pressure to the brake pedal, and I'm going to let the air stabilize again, and I'm going to time it again for 1 minute. I should not lose any more than 4 psi in 1 minute. Alright, now I'm going to pump the brake to see that my low air warning light comes on and or buzzer before 60 or 60 and above, and it is on. Then I'm going to continue pumping the brake down to see that my spring brakes come on automatically between 20 and 40 psi. And they have popped out. Okay, at this time I would restart the truck. Okay, we've restarted the engine. We're going to build our pressure up, and it should build from 85 to 100 psi in 45 seconds. That is at 1500 RPM. Okay? Now at this time I would ask the examiner if he would get out and help me check my lights, and I'm going to give him hand signals. What I'm going to do is for the cab lights, I'm going to wave across the window and point up for my cab lights. For my my left indicator, I will put my arm out to the left, bring my arm up for the right indicator, put 4 fingers up for 4 ways, drop my hand and put my fist down for brake lights, and I will do this for high and low beam. And then I would ask him to get out.
Okay, we're halfway through the training video. What do you think? How's it going? It's a bit overwhelming, isn't it? I can tell you from years of experience that if you study this pre-trip inspection video along with the study guide that was sent along with it, you'll be much better prepared come test day. Now let's go back to Larry and we'll finish this pre-trip inspection.
Okay, I've exited the truck. I'm going to do my walk around, have the keys with me, put them in my pocket, start at the front. I'm going to start high, checking my cab ID lights, check that they're on, they're clean, working, proper color, which is amber, no cracked or broken lenses. I'm going to check my lights and reflectors, the turn signals here, right and left. Make sure they're clean, working, proper color, which is amber. And I'm also, like I said, checking my reflectors as well. Also checking the headlights, make sure there's no cracked or broken lenses, they're clean, and of course they are white. I'll work my way back, checking my mirrors. I want to make sure they're mounted securely, nuts and bolts are tight. I'm going to check my door, make sure the hinge works properly, make sure my latch properly. Then I'm going to come to my battery box, checking to make sure that it is mounted secure, nuts and bolts are tight. I would check my battery cables, make sure they're tight also, and also that they're not corroded. Brings me to my steps. I want to make sure my steps are fastened securely with nuts and bolts, and they will support my weight, which I've already shown they have. Come to my side indicator. It serves as a left turn signal, a running light, and also a reflector. Make sure it's clean, working, proper color, which should be amber with no crack or broken lenses. Into my fuel tank. Make sure it's fastened securely. My straps have rubber seals under them to prevent corrosion, and the nuts and bolts are tight. Checking my fuel cap. Make sure it is tight as well, not leaking. I'm checking fittings. I do have a fitting over here to the front. I'm checking the fitting, make sure it's secure and tight, not leaking. I'm checking under the fuel tank itself to make sure we have no leaks. Working back, come to my air lines. I'll just kind of step in here and you come that way. I check my air lines, make sure they're fastened secure to the back of the tractor. They're not cut, frayed, tangled, twisted together, and they're not leaking air. Check my electric cord, make sure it's fastened securely and has a safety catch on it so it doesn't slip out. Make sure it's not cut, chafed, or shorting out. I'm going to check my exhaust. I'm looking up at it to make sure I have no soot, which would indicate a leak. As I come down, I'm checking the mounting to make sure it's mounted securely, nuts or bolts are tight. And I say it comes all the way down to the frame. Then I check my frame. Make sure it's not cracked or broken or has any missing parts. Check my drive shaft. Check my drive shaft. Make sure that it's not twisted or dented. Make sure my U-joints are tight and secure. Okay. I come to my quarter fender. Make sure my quarter fender is here. It's fastened securely. I have my rain guards. Now I'm going to drop down and I'm going to do my check my brakes. I'm checking the air line. Make sure it's not cut, chafed, or leaking air. Checking my brake chamber. Make sure that it's mounted securely, nuts and bolts are tight. Make sure it's not dented. Make sure it doesn't have any holes rusted through it. I do have a clamp on it and it is tight. Check my slack adjuster. To check it, I would chalk the wheels, release the brakes. If it pulls about an inch, it probably needs adjusted. Also check my push rod. On my push rod, I want to make sure that it is not dented. Make sure the jam nut is tight. Make sure I have a clevis pin and a Carter key in the clevis pin. Also, if the brakes were fully applied, they should not be less than 90 degrees. Then I'm checking my brake lining. I want to make sure that they're not worn dangerously thin. I do have a backing plate. I can't see them, but I would still check to see, or check them if I could see them, to see that they're not worn dangerously thin, no grease or oil on them, and I do not have any cracks. Also checking my brake drum. Make sure it's not cracked or broken, and make sure I don't have any broken springs or bolts laying in the bottom. That brings me to my suspension. I'm checking my front mount. I do have a torque leaf here, so I'm checking my front mount and my rear mount. Make sure the nuts and bolts are tight. Also checking for cracks radiating from the bolt holes. I'm checking my torque rod or spring to make sure it's not cracked or broken. Make sure it's fastened securely, nut and bolts tight, and the bushing is there and is in good condition. Finishing my suspension, moving to the back. As I said, I'm checking the rear mount, make sure the nuts and bolts are tight. It is air ride, so I'm checking my air bag to make sure it's not leaking air. I also have a shock, which is up behind here. I want to make sure that the nuts and bolts are tight, that the bushings are there and good, and it's not leaking oil. Okay, now we're going to check our tread depth on both tires. Should have 430 seconds all the way across in every major groove. I do not have spacers. I have bud wheels, but I do want to check for proper spacing and no debris between the wheels. Alright, then I'm checking the inside and outside of both tires for cuts and bulges. Checking both rims for bends, breaks, or welds not factory. As I'm going around looking for bends and breaks, welds not factory, I'm checking for valve stems. I should have 2 of them. They should be centered, have a metal cap. I check pressure with a gauge. I don't have one, therefore I would thump my tires to check the air pressure. Then I want to check my lug nuts to make sure there are none missing. I'm looking for rust trails or cracks radiating from the bolt holes, which would indicate looseness. I want to check my axle seal, the inner and outer. I'm looking for a spray pattern, or I could find a puddle of oil at the bottom of the rim here. I would check this axle the same as I checked that one. Working my way back now, I'm going to check my mud flap, make sure it's fastened secure, has a cotter pin, it can't jump out, nuts and bolts are tight, and the flap itself is not damaged. I'm going to move underneath here. I'm going to check my tail lights, brake lights, signals. They should all be working. Proper color should be red with no cracked or broken lenses. Also check my backup light to make sure it's there and it is clean, no cracked or broken lenses, and it is white. Then I'm going to look into the back of my fifth wheel and make sure that the locking jaw is around the kingpin. Also to make sure I have no space between the upper and lower fifth wheel. Then I'll move back out of here, checking my fifth wheel platform. I want to check my fifth wheel platform, which holds the skid plate. Make sure all the nuts and bolts are tight. I do not have any cracks radiating from the bolt holes. I want to check the skid plate itself to make sure it has the locking pin in place and make sure it is well greased. Check my release lever, make sure it is in the proper lock position. I don't have a safety catch on this. If I did, I'd make sure it was over my release lever. Also checking my locking pin for my sliding fifth wheel to make sure it's in place and secure. And I have an air slider, so I'm also checking the hose and listening for an air leak. Also, I want to check back here with the locking pin for the fifth wheel to make sure I have enough distance here to make a turn without catching my tractor into my trailer. Now I'll check my trailer apron, make sure it's not damaged. I'm looking for dents or cracks or breaks in it. And then we'll move to the front. I'm checking lights and reflectors. It should be clean, working, proper color, which should be amber to the front. Check my header board. Make sure it's not damaged. I'm looking at the rivets to make sure they're in place and tight. Coming down to my electric cord. Make sure my electric cord is in proper position, fastened securely with the safety catch. Make sure my air lines are fastened properly, red to the left, blue to the right. Checking my hoses again, make sure they're not cut, chafed, or leaking. And then we're going to move on back. I do have another light here at the top, clean, working, proper color, which is amber. Also have reflective tape all the way down the side of my trailer. Working our way back, I come to my landing gear. I want to make sure my release or my crank handle is secured. Make sure that my landing gear is cranked all the way up. Check my braces, make sure the nuts and bolts are tight. Also checking welds to make sure they're not cracked or broken loose. While I'm here, I'm going to check the frame on my trailer. Checking the cross members, make sure they're not dented, twisted, or torn out. And make sure I have no holes in the floor of the trailer. Coming back to my indicator light in the middle of the trailer, serves as a light and reflector. Clean, working, proper color, which should be amber, with no cracked or broken lenses. We'll move on back. We come to our sliding tandem. Want to make sure my hoses are up, they're not touching the ground, getting damaged. Want to make sure the locking pin on the slider and the lock handle are in place and secured. This time I'm going to check my brakes. I'm going to check my hoses to make sure the fittings are tight, they're not cut, chafed, or leaking air. I want to check my brake chamber, make sure it's mounted securely, nuts and bolts are tight. I want to make sure it's not dented. I want to make sure it doesn't have any holes rusted through it. I have clamps. I want to make sure the clamps are there and they're not loose or secure. I would check my slack adjuster. To do that, I would chock the wheels, release the brakes. If it pulls about an inch, it probably needs adjusted. If the brakes were fully applied, it should not be less than 90 degrees. Also, I want to check my push rod. I want to make sure it's not dented. I want to make sure my jam nut is tight. Make sure my clevis pin is there and it has a Carter key in it to secure it. Then I come to my brake lining. My brake lining, make sure they're not worn dangerously thin. Make sure I have no grease or oil on them. And make sure they're not cracked. Check my brake drum. Make sure it's not cracked or broken or has a hole in it. Also checking to see that there are no loose bolts or springs laying in the bottom. Okay, now I come to my suspension. Checking the front mount and the rear mount. You might want to come back. You gotta do a lot of moving. That brings me to my suspension. I want to check the front mount and the rear mount. I want to make sure that the welds are secure, they're not cracked or broken loose. Nuts and bolts are tight. Check my torque rod, make sure the nut and bolt's tight on it. The bushing's good and is there. I'm going to check my leaf to make sure it's not cracked, broken, or shifted. Check my U-bolts. I have U-bolts down in here. I want to make sure they're there, not loose, and the nuts are tight. And my rear mount, as I mentioned earlier, is welded secure, and my nut and bolt is tight here. That brings me to, I want to check for 230 seconds, inch tread depth in every major groove. I do have bud wheels again. I do not have spacers, however I want to check to see I have proper spacing and to make sure I have no debris between the wheels. I'm going to check the inside and outside of both tires for cuts and bulges. We can check our rims for bends, brakes, and welds not factory. I'm looking for my valve stems, make sure they're centered. There's two of them. They have metal caps. I don't have an air pressure gauge, so I'm going to thump my tires to check the air pressure. Then we'll check the lug nuts. First of all, to make sure there are none missing. We're checking for cracks radiating from bolt holes or rust trails, which would indicate looseness. Brings me to my oil seals. I'll check the inside and outside oil seal. Checking them for leaks be indicated by a spray pattern or a puddle of oil. Here I have a sight glass. I could check the oil level here with the sight glass. If it were painted over, for some reason I couldn't read, I could pop the plug out, put my finger into the first knuckle. I should just touch oil. Then I would check this axle the same as I checked that axle. Moving on back, I'll check my rear clearance light. It's clean, working, proper color, which should be red with no cracked or broken lens. Also checking my tape, which I mentioned earlier. Check my mud flap. Make sure it's fastened securely, not damaged. Now I'm moving to the back. I'm going to check the back of my trailer. I'm going to check my my ID lights in the back to make sure they are clean, working, proper color, which should be red, and no cracked or broken lenses. Checking my left, right, turn signals, four-ways, tail lights. Make sure they're all working. Should be proper color, which is red, with no cracked or broken lenses. And I do have my reflective tape back here as well. Then I'm going to check my door. Make sure it's secure, latch secure. Make sure my cables are tight, which indicates they're not broken. And I have a seal all the way around the door. At this time I would check this side of the trailer the same way I checked the other side, and that completes my pre-trip.
Okay, you got that? Larry has just given you the tools to prepare for your CDL pre-trip inspection. Be sure to watch this video again, practice your pre-trip inspection as much as possible, and come prepared for your CDL test. Now, it's all up to you. Good luck and safe driving.
If you or someone you know would like more information on how to enter the exciting field of professional truck driving or become a highly skilled diesel technician, give us a call at 1-800-475-8337 or visit us on the web at tdds.edu.